Hi guys, in this short video, I am going to refresh the concept of extrusion as we saw it in class. So for that, remember extrusion is the process of creating new geometry by pulling geometry from existing polygons. So in order to showcase how this works, I'm going to create a cube in the center of my world by clicking on the cube option under the poly modeling shelf. And then I'm going to increase the size of that polygon under its node in the inputs area of the channel box to about, say, 6 by 6 by 6. So we get a little bit more of a visual. Now, in order to extrude, you have several options on how to access that. And you need to first define what it is that you're trying to extrude. So we'll start by extruding faces, which is what we're going to be using the most when we're working in 3D in box modeling. So we're going to right-click the object, and from the flyout menu, we're going to choose faces so that we have the ability to choose the face that we want to extrude. Assume for a second that I'm going to extrude this. Let me turn off the grid. I'm going to extrude this face right here. So to do that, I have two options, or several options actually. The first one is, since I am in the component mode, I can go ahead and press the Shift key and right-click to get my flyout menu. And from here, I can choose to extrude the face by going in here or into its options right here. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is by going into my modeling toolkit, as we saw in class, and choosing extrude from here. And that will also allow me to extrude. I can also go to edit mesh and go extrude options if I need to add options. And the shortest way, which probably will become your default, is to actually press the Shift key while you're using the move tool. So if I switch my tool to the move tool by pressing the W key on the keyboard, notice that I have my move tool. And I can move that face, but it's not extruding, it's simply resizing my object. But if I press the Shift key while I'm doing that, you will notice that my mouse says extrude underneath it, and I can click on any of the different axes in any of these arrows that indicate the different axes, and I can extrude in that chosen direction. So there are several ways of doing this. Now, as you notice, this extruded, and that's all it did. It didn't do anything else. If I wanted to take advantage of adding extra geometry or defining the geometry as I am extruding, then I need to use one of the other options that we talked about a second ago. So for example, in this case, I'm going to select this face right here, and I want to extrude that upwards. But instead of doing the shift and drag, I am going to press the shortcut Control E this time. Control E will open up my extrusion dialog box right here. It's a floating window, and that allows me to extrude and add different options as I am extruding. So for now, by default, once I click Control E, it creates an extrusion. So there's an extrusion already created. It also allows me to select an amount of extrusion by changing the translate value of whatever option I have available here. It also tells me how many subdivisions I am adding as I extrude. So I have this as a default of 8, but I can increase or decrease as necessary. And you can see that extra faces are being created. I can also go ahead and say thickness, so I can increase or decrease. And notice that I'm changing these values interactively by clicking on the actual label. You'll notice that I get the little arrows that allow me to click and drag in order to be able to change the values here interactively. Or you can go in and enter a number if you want to do it that way. It works both ways. Now I can go ahead and also click offset to increase or decrease the size of the resultant geometry. And then the other one that's here is what we call keep faces together. That by default is on. Now let's go ahead and extrude these two guys here. So I'm going to shift select these two faces. And actually, let's go ahead and extrude these two right here. That will showcase a little bit more in detail what I'm doing. In this case, instead of pressing the Control E, which is the shortcut, if you notice under Edit Mesh, you have a shortcut for extrusion, which is right here. Instead of doing that, this time I'm going to use the Extrude option from my toolkit. So I'm going to click Extrude. It does the exact same thing. It opens up the floating menu, and it allows me to select what I want to extrude. So if I keep the Keep Faces Together option on, watch what happens when I extrude. Let me drag one of the arrows, and you'll notice that the extrusion, let me reduce my divisions to 1. You will notice that the two faces that I am creating are together. Basically, the entire geometry is being created from that corner. That might not necessarily be what you want. Let me go ahead and change those divisions again to 1, and instead of dragging it from the arrow like I did a second ago, I am going to click on any of the little squares or the little boxes on the gizmo that comes up with the extrusion. And then I'm going to click from the center out, and you'll notice that I can go ahead and also use that option of the gizmo in order to increase or decrease the size of whatever I'm extruding. Notice that new geometry was created all around the selection that I had made. Let me undo that really quick. And let's go ahead and turn off the keep faces together option. So I'm going to turn that off by clicking on it. And when I go ahead and start changing the thickness of this, you will notice that the extrusions are being created, but they're not together. These two faces are separate. So it's creating new geometry that is being split, which is perhaps sometimes what you want to do depending on the need of what you're modeling. Okay, so one more thing to take into account is this guy right here. So for this, I am going to do something slightly different. Let me go ahead and select this entire object. So I'm going to right click, object mode, select, then I'm going to create a cylinder. Now this cylinder, I am going to change its settings. I'm going to go and make it a little bit bigger. So I'm going to make it about 4 in width and height about 4. And I'm only going to make about 4 subdivisions. So actually make it a little bit more. So that way it actually looks like a cylinder. So I'm going to go ahead and remove these guys right here. Let me go ahead and go to face mode and tab. While pressing tab, I'm going to paint select this entire thing, and then I'm going to hit delete. I'm going to rotate this a little bit. And what I want to do is I want to extrude an edge this time. So I'm going to extrude this edge. I'm going to select that, and I am going to go ahead and press Control E to call the extrusion tool. Now you notice that by default, when I did that, it centers by default that gizmo that we created right at the center of the selection. So in this case, at the center of that edge. So if I were to extrude, and you, by the way, you can extrude an edge, as you can see, you can extrude from that point if you want to. You can scale from it as well if you want to do the extrusion by scaling. But you'll notice that this gizmo that we're using for extrusion has this little switch right here. This little switch allows you to either maintain right now the extrusion from the center of the object, so focusing on the object itself, or if I click on it, it will switch to orient that extrusion based on the value of the entire world. So you're basically changing the position of your gizmo selection based on whether you want to do it like this based on the orientation of the selection or on the orientation of the entire world, meaning the entire scene. So the option is yours. You can choose either one of the two, and depending on how you want to extrude, that will serve the purposes for what you're working on at the time. Finally, in some other instances, you might not only have one edge selected, so you might have several edges selected, or several faces for that matter. And you might want to also change the positioning of the actual gizmo depending on what you are trying to accomplish with the extrusion. So let me double click on this edge right here to select that entire edge loop around the bottom of that geometry. And then I'm gonna go ahead and press Control E to call the extrusion tool. Now you'll notice that by default, it's probably selecting the last item in the chain of selection, which is this edge right here. And that is gonna be the center of the anchor point of the extrusion that I am creating. Let me orbit a little bit so you guys can see what's happening. So it is basically any extrusion that I do will be based off that particular point. That might be what you want in some instances. In some other instances, you actually want to have the average center of what you are creating. That, in those cases, this little switch will push that anchor point to the center of the world, and it will actually, or the selection, sorry, the average center of the selection, and it will orient the gizmo in the direction of what the orientation of the world is. In this case, as you can see, the gizmo switches position to match that of the actual world. Take a look and compare this here with the gizmo arrows, and that will tell you that you basically are now matching the world, and this anchor point has been placed in the center, in the average center of the geometry that you have selected. And then at that point, you can go ahead and use the arrows to extrude. Remember, when you create the extrusion, by simply doing the act of extrusion, you automatically have created the geometry. So be very careful not to double click or to press Control E or to click elsewhere and come back and extrude again, because you will have edges over edges or faces over faces. And because you didn't do the actual pull-in, you didn't move the extrusion, you didn't change the thickness of it, then you might have geometry that is on top of one another, creating issues when you go ahead and animate or when you render. Finally, just as something that I wanted to mention, you can also extrude vertices. Now, this is uncommon, but you can actually do it. So let me select this vertex right here, and I'm going to go ahead and press Control E, and you'll notice that I have a vertex that has been extruded. It gives me values on what can I do with that particular extrusion, and it allows me to control it. I use the poke tool instead of extruding when I'm doing this kind of a geometry, and we'll talk about the poke tool in more detail in our next class.